Hey, Jazz fans. Let's talk about Black Lives Matter. The NBA and Jazz organization have openly embraced the phrase, which has made some of you really uncomfortable. So please stay with me. This 5-minute fight against racism is for you. A few days after George Floyd was murdered by Minneapolis police, demonstrations erupted across the entire country, at least one in every single American state. Reports suggest that it may be the largest protest in American history. Around the country, the vast majority of protesters marched and waved signs and shouted slogans and listened to rally speeches, but we also saw instances of looting and vandalism. On the local news, I saw a police car burning a few blocks from Vivint Arena, the same street where my kids and I marched just a few hours earlier. I saw some confusion and anger on social media when the Jazz publicly affirmed Black Lives Matter. Were the Jazz endorsing a violent group? What is Black Lives Matter? Well, it's a statement, it's a rallying cry, a movement, a slogan, a demand, a protest, a declaration. It's lots of things, but it's not a single group. So the first thing to keep in mind is that you can confidently say Black Lives Matter without affiliating with any organization, like Mitt Romney did, and like the Jazz and the NBA did. But yes, there is also an organization. It was founded by a group of black women in 2013 after teenager Trayvon Martin was murdered with a bag of Skittles in his pocket. The man who murdered him was acquitted. So these women wanted to protest discrimination against black people in the U.S. criminal justice system. But they've also worked to address the school-to-prison pipeline, affordable housing, hunger, and other health issues. They work with local grassroots organizers to improve life for black people in America. We can scrutinize how they spend their money or what kind of approaches they endorse, but at the very least, all of us should be able to agree with their underlying goal, creating a more equal society for black people in America. But again, as the Deseret News reported, Black Lives Matter is not one centralized organization. All right, but are they violent? Nothing in any of the organization's materials encourages any violence. But when rioting broke out this year, I saw a lot of Facebook posts that were trying to use Dr. Martin Luther King to lecture black people about how to protest. Be nonviolent. Sure, I think that's great, but let's look what else Dr. King had to say. I'm still committed to nonviolence. I'm absolutely convinced that a riot merely intensifies the fears of white communities while relieving their guilt. But it is not enough for me to condemn riots. It would be morally irresponsible for me to do that without at the same time condemning the intolerable conditions in our society that cause individuals to feel they have no other alternative. I must say tonight that a riot is the language of the unheard. And what is it America has failed to hear? That the promises of freedom and justice have not been met. But large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice and humanity. Riots are terrible, but too many people are more concerned about riots than they are concerned about the racism and the injustice that sparks those riots. Maybe you're wondering why Black Lives Matter groups didn't condemn the violence and the looting. Well, the simple answer is a lot of them did. If you're asking that question, then you haven't been listening. Speaking of Dr. King, another common reaction to the Black Lives Matter movement is the accusation that it's actually a Marxist plot. Back in the 1960s, a lot of white people were convinced that Dr. King himself was part of a vast communist conspiracy to overthrow America. I know that sounds ridiculous, but they called interracial marriage a communist plot too. This was all a scare tactic then, and it's still a scare tactic today. We'll talk more about it in later 5-minute fights. Does Black Lives Matter want to destroy the nuclear family? No. If you think black people have a problem with families, then you must not know any black people. But the organization Black Lives Matter recognizes how black family structures have been disrupted by centuries of oppression, from enslaved people being separated from kin and family at the whims of their white slavers, to the disproportionate number of black men in prison in the United States today. Black communities had to adapt to create strong, non-traditional families, beyond the stereotypical two-parent, two-child household. And by the way, less than half of all kids of every racial background in the United States have that kind of model home. Black Lives Matter supports a variety of family structures, including two-parent nuclear households. What about defunding the police? We're going to address criminal justice reform in a future episode. How about all lives matter? Well, of course they do, which means that black lives matter. So let's hear you say it. If you believe all lives matter, then black lives matter. In spite of all those misconceptions and more, we can't really cover them all in 5 minutes. Public support for Black Lives Matter has skyrocketed this year among Democrats, Independents, and Republicans all across the political spectrum. More than half of all Americans support Black Lives Matter as a movement. But at the same time, people don't always agree on how to solve racist problems. And there have always been different voices and different approaches. We don't have to agree on everything in order to agree on something. So if your overall goal is to fight racism, don't get distracted by debates about tactics. Look for ways that you can make the biggest impact where you are and start working. Okay, let's recap. First, Black Lives Matter is part of today's diverse civil rights movement. It's not a single group. You don't have to belong to an official organization in order to boldly say that Black Lives Matter. Second, the organization called Black Lives Matter has been misrepresented by people who want to preserve the status quo. Resist misinformation. Don't throw the baby out with what you assume is just bathwater. And finally, look for shared goals and put yourself to work where you can be most effective fighting racism. And that fight really begins in our own hearts and our own minds. And then it becomes part of our actions. And then we make it part of our community. Your assignment today is to check out what local Black Lives Matter activists in Utah have been up to. Dangerous things like ski camps and meetings with local police and STEM education programs and things like that. So you can check out the links below. We'll see you next time on 5 Minute Fights Against Racism.